Hey guys, tonight we begin a massive 600-year journey into the dark ruins of Roman Britain, uncovering how a band of pagan mercenaries forged the nation of England from absolute chaos. What if I told you that the England we know today was forged not by native Britons or noble Roman legions, but by ruthless pagan mercenaries who arrived in the darkness of the 5th century, built a golden civilization from the ruins, and then lost it all to a single fatal trick on a bloody hill in 1066? And before we dive in, I'm genuinely curious, where in the world are you right now? What city? What time is it there? Drop it in the comments. I read every single one, and your stories always make my night. Imagine standing on the white cliffs of Dover in the early years of the 5th century. The wind is cold, the sea is grey and restless. For nearly 400 years, this island was a proud province of the Roman Empire. There were bustling cities. There were paved roads, heated public baths, and beautiful villas decorated with intricate mosaic floors. There was a sense of order, a sense of permanence, but nothing lasts forever. By the year 410, the heart of the empire was failing. Rome itself was under attack by barbarian tribes. The emperors needed every soldier they could find just to protect their own capital. And so, the agonizing order was given. The Roman legions packed their gear. They marched down the long, straight roads they had built, boarded their galleys, and sailed away across the Channel. They never came back. The native Britons were left completely alone. You have to imagine the sheer terror of that moment. The shield that had protected them for centuries was suddenly gone. The grand stone buildings began to crumble. Weeds broke through the paved streets. The mechanisms of a complex society, the taxes, the trade, the administration simply dissolved into the mist. And the wolves were circling. From the north came the Picts, pouring over the remnants of Hadrian's Wall. From the west, Irish raiders swept in from the sea. The Britons were desperate. They sent letters to the Roman emperor, begging for military aid. The historical records call these letters the groans of the Britons. The emperor's reply was cold and final. He told them to look to their own defences. When a society is backed into a corner, its leaders often make decisions that seal their own doom. In the mid-5th century, a powerful British leader, a man remembered by history as a proud tyrant named Vortigern, made a fatal calculation. If the Romans wouldn't protect them, he would hire someone who would. Vortigern looked across the turbulent waters of the North Sea. Over there, in the coastal swamps and dense forests of modern-day Denmark and northern Germany, lived fierce Germanic tribes. The Angles, the Saxons, the Jutes. These were people who lived for war. They didn't have cities or written laws. They lived in small, tightly knit communities bound by blood and loyalty. They worshipped gods of thunder and battle. They were masters of the sea, sailing in long, shallow draft wooden ships that could cut through the ocean waves and glide silently up shallow rivers. Vortigern sent word to these pagan warriors. He offered them land on the eastern shores of Britain, down in Kent, in exchange for their swords. They accepted. According to the old legends, they arrived under the leadership of two brothers, Hengist and Horsa. At first, the arrangement worked. The fierce Germanic mercenaries crushed the Pictish invaders. They proved their worth. But soon, more ships began to arrive, and more, and more. The mercenaries looked around. They saw an island with deep, fertile soil. They saw lush green valleys and wide rivers. And they saw that the native Britons, despite their numbers, were weak, fractured, and unable to mount a coordinated defence. Why should they fight for scraps of land, they wondered, when they could take it all? The alliance shattered. The mercenaries turned their iron swords against the people who had hired them. The transition was not a peaceful migration. It was a catastrophe. Our best surviving account of this era comes from a British monk named Gilders, writing a desperate, furious book called The Ruin of Britain in the 6th century. Gilders describes a wave of fire spreading from the eastern sea all the way to the western ocean. He writes of cities besieged, of stone walls collapsing, of holy altars smeared with blood. He describes how the native people were slaughtered in the streets, or driven out of their homes, forced to flee into the wild mountains of the west, or across the sea to northern France. Archaeology tells a similar story, but in a quieter, more haunting way. If you dig into the soil of eastern England today, you won't find many grand buildings from this time. Instead, you find the remains of sunken huts, small, crude wooden dwellings with thatched roofs built right over hollowed-out pits in the ground. Near a small village called Mucking, near the mouth of the River Thames, archaeologists uncovered a massive settlement, over 200 of these sunken huts. This wasn't a temporary military camp, this was a permanent colony. These Germanic warriors were no longer just raiders. They were bringing their wives, their children, their tools, their pottery. They were putting down roots in the rich British soil. They named the land after themselves. You can still see it today. Places ending in ing, or ham, or ton. Hastings meant the people of Haster. Reading meant the people of Reader. They carved up the landscape based on their family tribes. It was a society completely alien to the Roman world. It was a world where a man's worth was measured in loyalty to his lord and his kin. If someone in your family was killed, you were bound by honour to seek revenge. To forget a blood feud was a permanent disgrace. Slowly, methodically, these pagan settlers pushed inland. They moved up the Thames Valley. They pushed west from East Anglia. They pushed north from Wessex. But the native Britons did not vanish without a fight. Somewhere around the year 500, the Britons managed to rally their forces. History becomes incredibly blurry here, fading into myth. But the records suggest that a great war leader emerged to unite the fractured British tribes. A man whose name would echo through eternity, even if his real life remains a shadow. Arthur. Under this leader, the Britons met the advancing Saxons at a place called Mount Badon. We still don't know exactly where this hill is, but we know what happened there. The Britons fought with the fury of a people who had nowhere left to run. And they won. The Battle of Mons Badonicus was a crushing defeat for the Saxon invaders. It was a shock to their momentum. It secured a generation of peace for the native Britons. The Saxon advance stalled, and for several decades, a fragile, uneasy border existed between the two worlds. But it was only a temporary pause. The demographic tide was simply too strong. The invaders kept arriving from across the sea. The Britons, exhausted and battered by plagues and endless small skirmishes, slowly lost ground. By the end of the 6th century, the Saxons were on the move again. They pushed into the South Midlands. They won a decisive battle that gave them control of the old Roman cities of Gloucester and Bath. The map of Britain was fundamentally redrawn. The native Britons were pushed into the rugged, mountainous fringes of the island into the lands we now know as Wales, and the long peninsula of Cornwall. The invaders called these people the Welsh, a word that originally just meant foreigners or slaves. The Roman province of Britannia was dead. In its place, half a dozen aggressive, fiercely independent Anglo-Saxon kingdoms began to take shape. East Anglia, Essex, Sussex, Wessex, Mercia, Northumbria. These people brought with them a dark, heroic culture. They had no cities, they had no written history, but they had their swords, their loyalty, and their absolute belief in destiny. They had conquered the island. Now, they had to build a civilization upon its ashes, and they would start, not with stone temples, but with timber halls glowing warmly in the dark, cold night. Chapter 2. The Golden Mead Hall. Step out of the freezing rain of the 5th century, wipe the mud of the Dark Ages from your boots, and walk with me into the warm, flickering light of the 7th century. The chaos of the initial invasions has settled. The blood on the hilltops has dried. The Anglo-Saxon tribes have carved the ruined island into distinct kingdoms. And in this new world, they have built something unexpectedly magnificent. To understand the soul of these people, we have to look underground. Imagine the year 1939. On the quiet, windswept coast of East Anglia, at a place called Sutton Hoo, an archaeologist was digging into a large grassy mound. What he found beneath the earth would change our understanding of the Dark Ages forever. He didn't find a skeleton. He found the shadow of a ghost ship. It was an 80-foot-long wooden vessel that had been dragged up from the river and buried under tons of earth. The wood had long since rotted away, but it left a perfect imprint in the sand, right down to the iron rivets holding the spectral planks together. And in the centre of this ghost ship lay a burial chamber filled with unimaginable wealth. There was a magnificent iron helmet, covered in intricate bronze panels showing warriors in combat. There was a heavy gold belt buckle, twisting with carved, interlacing serpents. There were shoulder clasps made of pure gold, inlaid with blood-red garnets that caught the light like fire. This was not the crude loot of a mindless barbarian. This was high art. The craftsmanship was exquisite, perhaps the finest ever discovered from Northern Europe in this era. And more remarkably, the treasures came from all over the known world. There was silver from the Byzantine Empire. There were coins from the Kingdom of the Franks. There was even a strange, beautifully carved whetstone that experts believe was a symbol of absolute authority, a scepter. This was the grave of a king. Historians believe it was likely the resting place of King Raedwald, a powerful ruler of the East Angles who dominated the political landscape in the early 7th century. When you look at the treasures of Sutton Hoo, you realise something profound about the Anglo-Saxon mind. They loved beauty, they loved glory, but above all, they understood the fragile economy of power. In this violent world, a king's authority did not come from a piece of paper or an ancient constitution. It came from his wealth and his willingness to give it away. Kingdoms rose and fell based entirely on treasure. A successful king was a warlord who conquered his enemies, took their wealth, and then distributed it generously to his followers. In the old poetry, a good king is literally called a ring giver. If a king was brave and generous, warriors from all over the country would flock to his banner. The historian Bede wrote of one king, Oswin of Deira, who was so tall, handsome, and famously generous that nobles from every kingdom competed just to serve him. But this system was terrifyingly unstable. Power rested on military strength. Military strength rested on the ability to reward your men, and the ability to reward your men required constant conquest. If a king grew old, or sick, or suffered a single bad defeat on the battlefield, the wealth dried up. And when the wealth dried up, the loyalty vanished. The king's followers would scatter to the winds, seeking a new, richer lord. To survive in this brutal, shifting landscape, a man needed a lord, and the absolute centre of an Anglo-Saxon warrior's life was his lord's Mead Hall. Close your eyes and build the hall in your mind. It is a massive rectangular building, constructed from heavy, dark timber. Outside, the night is black and hostile. The wind howls off the North Sea. There are wolves in the dense forests. There are rival tribes waiting in the darkness. But inside the hall, it is a sanctuary. A great fire roars in a long hearth down the centre of the earthen floor. The air is thick with the smell of wood smoke, roasting meat, and human sweat. Men sit shoulder to shoulder on wooden benches. They pass heavy drinking horns back and forth, filled with sweet, fermented honey mead or dark ale. Here, in the heat and the noise, the bonds of society are forged. The warriors, known as Thegans, swear absolute oaths of loyalty to their king. They vow to defend him, to protect him, and if necessary, to die for him. To survive a battle where your lord is killed, to walk away from his fallen body and return home, was considered the ultimate, unforgivable disgrace. A man who did that became a faceless outcast, forever ruined. The deepest tie, even stronger than the bond to a king, was the bond of blood. Kinship was everything. If your brother was killed, you did not call the police. You did not go to a judge. You took your sword, gathered your kin, and you took a life in return. The blood feud was a sacred duty. To forget revenge was to accept eternal shame. Though, as society slowly developed, kings began to encourage a slightly less bloody alternative, a system of compensation called wergild, literally man-gold. If you killed someone, you could pay their family a specific amount of money based on the victim's social rank to stop the cycle of violence. But violence was always simmering just beneath the surface. And in the great Mead Hall, when the feasting was done, the room would fall quiet, the fire would pop and crackle. A man would step forward, holding a small wooden harp. This was the scop, the professional poet, the memory keeper of the tribe. He would pluck the strings and sing the old dark tales. He would sing of heroes and monsters, of ancient betrayals and tragic deaths. We still have fragments of these epic poems. The most famous is the tale of Beowulf. Beowulf is a story of a mighty warrior who travels to the hall of a Danish king to slay a horrific monster that stalks the night. It is a story of superhuman strength and courage. But beneath the heroics, the poem reveals the deep anxiety of the Anglo-Saxon soul. It paints a picture of a world surrounded by darkness, a world where joy is fleeting, where fate is absolute, and where every great king will eventually fall. When Beowulf dies at the end of the epic, fighting a dragon to protect his people, his followers do exactly what the people of East Anglia did for King Raedwald at Sutton Hoo. They build a great mound high on a cliff overlooking the sea. They fill it with useless, glittering treasure. And they ride their horses around the tomb, chanting his name, singing of his greatness, mourning the end of an era. It is beautiful, but it is profoundly sad. This was a deeply fatalistic society. They worshipped the Old Norse gods, Woden, the god of wisdom and war, Tiw, the god of combat, Thor, the god of thunder. We still speak their names every week. Tuesday is Tiw's day, Wednesday is Woden's day, Thursday is Thor's day. P5, they worshipped in hidden, remote places in dark woods, on lonely hills, sacrificing to stones and trees and deep wells. But these gods did not offer comfort, they did not offer salvation. They only offered a chance to die with honour. There is a moment recorded in history that captures this psychological state perfectly. It is perhaps the most beautiful metaphor to survive from the Dark Ages. It was the early 7th century. King Edwin of Northumbria was holding a council in his hall. He was listening to a missionary speak about a new, strange religion from the south, a religion called Christianity. Edwin asked his noblemen what they thought of this new teaching. An old, battle-scarred warrior stood up by the fire. He looked at the king, and he spoke. "My lord," he said, "when you are sitting at dinner with your commanders and your thengs in the dead of winter, the fire is burning in the centre of the hall, and it is warm and bright. But outside, the freezing rain and the snowstorms are raging. Suddenly, a single sparrow flies swiftly through the hall. It enters through one door and flies out through another. For that one brief moment while it is inside, it is safe from the winter storm. But the moment of calm passes in a flash. The bird flies back out into the bitter cold, vanishing from your sight. The life of a man," the old warrior said, "is exactly like that sparrow. We appear for a short while in the warmth. But of what went before this life, and of what follows after, we know absolutely nothing. If this new religion can tell us something more certain," the warrior concluded, "then I believe we should follow it." That was the spiritual hunger of the Anglo-Saxon world. They had built a society that functioned. Beneath the glittering, violent lives of the kings, there was an impressive order taking root in the countryside. The land was being divided into administrative districts called hundreds. The soil was measured in hides, an area of land large enough to support one family for a single year. At the bottom of the social ladder was the Ceol, the free peasant. They lived on isolated farms or in small, scattered hamlets. They worked the heavy, wet soil, raising cattle and ploughing fields. They paid taxes to the king's agents, rendering tribute in sacks of grain, young calves, or jars of sweet honey. They provided the massive base of the pyramid that kept the Mead Halls warm and the warlords in their gold armour. It was a structured world, a recovering world, but it was a world missing a centre. It was a world waiting in the dark. The pagan gods had brought them across the sea. The pagan swords had conquered the island. But to build a nation that would last, they needed something more powerful than blood feud and gold. They needed a story that could conquer death itself. And as the 7th century dawned, men in simple robes were walking up the old, broken Roman roads, carrying wooden crosses, ready to give them exactly that. Chapter 3. The Sparrow in the Storm. We left that lone sparrow flying out of the warm Mead Hall, plunging back into the freezing winter storm. For the Anglo-Saxon warlords, life was exactly like that. A brief, violent flash of warmth, surrounded by a terrifying unknown. They had conquered Britain. They had built their timber halls. They had forged their heavy swords and hoarded their gold. But their gods Woden, Thor, Tiw were gods of war. They demanded blood and offered only a warrior's death. They had no answers for the quiet terror of the night. They offered no hope for the weak, the sick, or the peaceful. To find that hope, we have to look far to the south, to a city the Saxons only knew as a myth, Rome. The Roman legions had abandoned Britain 2 centuries earlier. The great empire had shattered, but a new kind of empire was growing among the marble ruins of the eternal city. An empire of the spirit. Legend has it that in the late 6th century, a man named Gregory was walking through the slave market in Rome. He saw a group of boys for sale. They had pale skin, bright blue eyes, and striking blonde hair. He asked the merchants who these boys were. "They are Angles," the merchant replied. "From the island of Britain. They are pagans." Gregory looked at them and famously said, "They are not Angles, but angels, and they must be saved." When Gregory later became pope, he did not forget those boys. In the year 597, he dispatched a monk named Augustine to the shores of Britain. Augustine was terrified. He was a civilized Roman heading to the edge of the known world, a place rumoured to be filled with bloodthirsty savages. He actually stopped halfway through France and tried to turn back, but Pope Gregory ordered him forward. Augustine and his small band of monks landed in the Kingdom of Kent, in the southeastern corner of the island. They carried a silver cross and a painted image of Christ on a wooden board. They chanted litanies as they walked up the beach. They were greeted by the King of Kent, a powerful warlord named Ethelbert. Ethelbert was cautious. He insisted on meeting the monks outdoors, believing that if they used dark magic it wouldn't work under the open sky. But Ethelbert had a secret advantage. He was married to a Frankish princess named Bertha, and Bertha was already a Christian. She had been praying quietly in a ruined, overgrown Roman church on the edge of the kingdom for years. The king listened to Augustine. He did not kill him. Instead, he gave the monks permission to preach, and eventually, the king himself was baptized. It seemed like a massive, sudden victory. The Pope was overjoyed. A church was built in Canterbury. Thousands of Saxons were reportedly baptized in the rivers, but this new faith was incredibly fragile. In the Anglo-Saxon world, the people followed their lord. If the king became a Christian, his warriors became Christians. But it was entirely superficial. They just added Jesus to their list of gods, hoping this new deity would bring them victory in battle. If a Christian king was killed by a pagan rival, his people immediately assumed the Christian god was weak. The kingdom would instantly revert to the old ways. Bishops would be chased out. Churches would be abandoned. For decades, the light of Christianity flickered wildly. It was a political tool tied directly to the rising and falling fortunes of brutal men. To truly conquer the soul of England, the faith had to come from somewhere else. It couldn't just come from the organised top-down Roman structure in the south. It had to come from the wild, desolate north. While Rome was sending monks to Kent, a completely different brand of Christianity was brewing in Ireland. The Irish had been converted a century earlier by St. Patrick. Their church was isolated from Europe. It didn't have massive cathedrals or powerful bishops in silk robes. The Celtic church was rough, ascetic, and deeply spiritual. It was organised around remote monasteries governed by abbots. These men sought God in isolation, in the crashing of the ocean waves and the howling of the wind. In the 6th century, an Irish monk named Columba sailed across the sea and built a tiny monastery on a bleak, windswept rock off the coast of Scotland. The island was called Iona. From Iona, the Celtic monks began to push southward. In the year 633, a young warlord named Oswald became the king of Northumbria, the great northern kingdom of the Anglo-Saxons. Oswald was a Christian, but he hadn't been converted by the Romans. He had spent his youth living in exile among the Irish monks. When Oswald took the throne, he didn't ask Rome for help. He sent a message to Iona. He asked them to send him a man who could save his people. They sent a monk named Aidan. Aidan was everything the proud Roman missionaries were not. He didn't care about politics. He didn't care about gold. King Oswald gave Aidan another desolate, beautiful island off the eastern coast of Northumbria to build his monastery. The island was called Lindisfarne. Twice a day, the freezing tide rushes in and completely cuts the island off from the mainland. It is a place of profound silence and isolation. From this tiny rock, Aidan began to change the world. He didn't stay in his monastery. He didn't ride a horse, because riding a horse was the symbol of a warrior, of a lord. Aidan walked. He walked hundreds of miles across the rugged dirt tracks of northern England. When he met a rich lord, he demanded they give away their wealth to the poor. When he met a slave or a peasant working in the mud, he stopped. He treated them as absolute equals. He told them that God loved them just as much as he loved the king. In a society built entirely on social hierarchy, bloodlines, and slavery, this message was radically subversive, and it was incredibly attractive. The Celtic monks lived simply. They slept on cold stone. They fasted. Their absolute sincerity won the hearts of the common people in a way the Roman diplomats never could. Slowly, the landscape began to change. Minsters, early monasteries, and communities of priests began to appear across the country. They were built on lonely hillsides, in the bends of rivers, in the ruins of old Roman forts. Inside these walls, a new kind of magic was happening. Men were holding pieces of stretched calfskin. They were dipping goose feathers into crushed iron galls and soot. They were writing. Literacy had returned to the island. At great monasteries like Wearmouth and Jarrow, monks imported glassmakers from France to fill their stone churches with coloured light. They built massive libraries. They began to produce illuminated manuscripts books filled with swirling Celtic patterns, golden leaves, and intricate, mind-bending geometry. In the middle of a dark, violent era, these monasteries were beacons of astonishing beauty and scholarship. The monks preserved the history of their people. If they hadn't sat in the freezing cold, copying text by candlelight, we would know absolutely nothing about this time. But a storm was brewing. You had two different Christian traditions spreading across England, the Roman tradition moving up from the south, the Celtic tradition moving down from the north. They were fundamentally different, and they collided over something that seems trivial to us today, but meant everything to them: the calendar. Because they had been isolated from each other for centuries, the Roman Church and the Celtic Church used different mathematical formulas to calculate the date of Easter. Easter was the most sacred day of the year. It was the day the world was saved. If you celebrated it on the wrong day, you were out of sync with God. You were out of sync with the cosmos. In the Kingdom of Northumbria, this caused absolute chaos. King Oswy, the brother of Oswald, followed the Celtic tradition, but his wife, a princess from the south, followed the Roman tradition. The royal court was completely divided. One week, the king would be feasting, drinking mead, and celebrating the resurrection of Christ. But sitting right next to him, the queen would be in tears, refusing to eat, dressed in rags, because according to her calendar, it was still Lent, the darkest time of fasting and sorrow. It was an impossible situation. The kingdom was spiritually split in two. In the year 664, King Oswy decided to end the madness. He summoned the greatest minds from both sides to a monastery perched high on a cliff, overlooking the grey North Sea. The place was called Whitby. Imagine the tension in that stone hall. On one side sat the Celtic monks, with their strange tonsures, their heads shaved from ear to ear across the front. They argued that their tradition was passed down from St. Columba, an undisputed holy man. They represented the wild, independent spirit of the north. On the other side sat the Roman priests, dressed in fine vestments. They argued that their tradition came directly from Rome, from St. Peter. King Oswy listened in silence. He was a practical man. He was a warlord. He understood the mechanics of power. He looked at the Roman priests and asked them a simple question. "Is it true," the king asked, "that the keys to the kingdom of heaven were given to St. Peter?" The priests nodded. "It is true, my lord. Christ gave the keys to Peter." The king turned to the Celtic monks. "Can you prove that such power was given to your Columba?" The monks shook their heads. "No, my lord." King Oswy made his decision. "Then I say to you," the king announced, "that Peter is the doorkeeper, and I will not go against him, because when I reach the gates of heaven, I do not want the man who holds the keys to turn his back on me." With that single practical calculation, the fate of England was sealed. The Celtic monks who refused to accept the Roman ways packed their bags and walked away, retreating back to the lonely islands of the north. The Roman Church had won. 5 years later, the Pope sent a new archbishop to Canterbury. His name was Theodore. He was a Greek monk, a brilliant administrator from the Eastern Mediterranean. He was an outsider, untangled in the bitter rivalries of the Anglo-Saxon kings. Theodore travelled relentlessly across the kingdoms. He organised the scattered churches. He established strict boundaries for dioceses. He forced the independent, stubborn bishops to submit to a single, unified chain of command. For the very first time in history, the people of the island shared a common structure. Politically, they were still violently divided. The King of Mercia still wanted to slaughter the King of Wessex. The blood feuds still raged in the forests. The Mead Halls still echoed with the songs of war. But spiritually, they were now one entity. They attended councils together. They read the same books. They prayed on the same days. A monk named Bede, sitting in his quiet cell in Northumbria, would soon write a masterpiece called the Ecclesiastical History of the English People. Notice that phrase, the English people. Before there was a nation on the map, there was an idea in the mind. The warring tribes of Angles, Saxons and Jutes were slowly beginning to see themselves as a single, unified culture under the eyes of God. The Sparrow had finally found a home in the light, but this newfound peace was a fragile illusion. Because while the English were looking up at heaven, a terrifying shadow was gathering across the sea. The darkest chapter of their history was just about to begin. Chapter 4. The Mercian Supremacy. As the 8th century dawned, the monks were safe in their stone choirs, singing the new Latin hymns. The illuminated manuscripts were being painstakingly painted in the freezing scriptoriums of the north. The soul of the island had been unified under the cross, but out in the muddy fields and the dark forests, the swords were still swinging. The idea of a single, unified English nation was still just a dream in the minds of the priests. On the ground, the reality was a brutal, endless cage match between rival warlords. The kingdoms of Wessex, Northumbria, and East Anglia were constantly violently colliding. But in the centre of the island, in the lush, green heartland known as the Midlands, a superpower was waking up. This was the kingdom of Mercia. For the better part of the 8th century, Mercia dominated the political landscape, and their supremacy reached its terrifying, magnificent peak under a man who is arguably the greatest English king you have never heard of. His name was Offa. King Offa took the throne in the year 757. He did not ask for loyalty, he extracted it. He was a man of terrifying vision and absolute, cold-blooded ruthlessness. He looked at the chaotic patchwork of Anglo-Saxon kingdoms and decided that they did not need a friendly neighbour, they needed a master. Before Offa, powerful kings were sometimes called over-kings. They would force weaker neighbours to pay them tribute, but they generally let the local royal families survive. Offa changed the rules. He didn't just want tribute, he wanted total submission. He absorbed the smaller kingdoms. He treated the ancient, proud royal family of Kent like disobedient servants. When the King of East Anglia caused trouble, Offa didn't negotiate. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records the event with chilling brevity. This year, King Offa of Mercia ordered the head of the King of East Anglia to be struck off. Offa was the first ruler to use a new, absolute title in his official charters. He called himself the King of the English. But Offa was far more than just a bloodthirsty warlord. He was a brilliant, calculating statesman. He understood that true power required more than just men with heavy swords. It required administration. It required infrastructure. And, above all, it required money. Before the 8th century, the economy of the island was localized and crude. People traded in cattle, honey, and grain. If they used coins, they were usually foreign gold pieces or small, untrusted chips of silver that were practically worthless a few miles away from where they were made. Offa completely revolutionized this system. He introduced a new, beautifully designed currency, the silver penny. Imagine holding one of Offa's coins in the palm of your hand. It is surprisingly heavy, made of high-quality silver. On one side, stamped in sharp, clear relief, is the stylized portrait of the king himself. His hair is intricately braided. His name is proudly inscribed around the edge. This wasn't just money. This was mass propaganda. Every time a merchant bought a sack of wool, every time a peasant paid for a loaf of bread, they were forced to look at the face of their absolute master. And these coins were everywhere. Archaeologists haven't just found them in massive buried treasure hoards. They have found single silver pennies dropped in the mud of ancient marketplaces, scattered across the countryside. This tells us something vital. Money had become a part of everyday life. The economy was booming, and that economic boom caught the attention of the outside world. Across the English Channel, in the vast territory that is now France and Germany, ruled the greatest monarch of the early Middle Ages, Charlemagne, the master of Europe, the Holy Roman Emperor. Free. Normally, a man like Charlemagne would view an Anglo-Saxon king as a petty, irrelevant barbarian. But not Offa. We still have a remarkable letter that Charlemagne sent to the Mercian court. In it, the great emperor of Europe addresses King Offa not as a subordinate, but as an equal. He calls him his dearest brother. Charlemagne and Offa negotiated international trade agreements. They argued over the size of the wool cloaks being exported from England. When they had a diplomatic falling out, Charlemagne actually closed the ports of France to English merchants, the first recorded trade embargo in English history. England was no longer an isolated, forgotten island floating in the mist. Thanks to Offa, it was a major player on the international stage. You could see this new global connection in the rapidly expanding trading towns. Places like London Wick, the Saxon predecessor to London, and Hamwick, down on the southern coast. Walk through the muddy streets of Hamwick in your mind. The air is thick with the smell of wood smoke, roasting fish, and hot tar. You hear a dozen different languages. You see Frisian merchants selling fine cloth and sailors unloading heavy amphorae of wine from the continent. The island was becoming rich. But Offa's greatest legacy was not made of silver or parchment or trade goods. It was made of earth. To the west of Mercia lay the dark, rugged mountains of Wales. The native Britons who had been pushed into those mountains centuries earlier had never forgotten what was taken from them. For generations, Welsh raiding parties would sweep down from the highlands, burn Mercian villages, steal the cattle, and vanish back into the mist before the Mercian army could respond. Offa decided to end it. He didn't try to conquer the Welsh mountains. Instead, he decided to draw a physical line across the earth, a line that separated his civilized kingdom from the wildness of the West. He ordered the construction of a massive earthwork. Today, we call it Offa's Dyke. It is a staggering feat of engineering, a continuous earthen bank and a deep ditch, running for roughly 150 miles, stretching from the northern sea down to the southern estuary. In some places, the bank was 25 feet high, with a sheer drop into the ditch below. Imagine the sheer human suffering required to build this. Thousands of peasants, the Seals, were drafted from their farms. They didn't have bulldozers or excavators. They had wooden spades, iron picks, and woven wicker baskets. Day after day, in the freezing rain and the baking sun, they dug into the hard clay and piled it high. Offa's Dyke was not a castle wall. It couldn't physically stop an army from crossing if they really wanted to, but that wasn't the point. It was a psychological barrier. It was an observation platform. From the top of the dyke, Mercian patrols could see miles into the Welsh valleys. If Welsh raiders crossed the dyke to steal cattle, they would have to drive those slow, heavy animals back up the steep artificial cliff to get home, making them easy targets for the Mercian guards. More than anything, the dyke was a monument to Offa's terrifying authority. Only a king with absolute, unquestioned control over vast human and material resources could command the landscape itself to change its shape. When you stand on the remains of Offa's Dyke today, as the sun goes down and the shadows stretch across the Welsh hills, you can still feel the weight of his ambition. But there is a dark, tragic irony to the story of the Mercian supremacy. Offa spent his entire life building an empire that was meant to last forever. He organised the church, he built fortified towns, he minted millions of silver coins. He sought to create a dynasty, to ensure that his son, Ecgfrith, would inherit this massive kingdom without opposition. Offa eliminated anyone who could possibly pose a threat. He executed his rivals. He banished distant relatives. He systematically pruned the royal family tree until only his direct bloodline remained. A famous scholar of the time, Alcuin of York, watched this slaughter with deep horror. Alcuin wrote a letter warning that this bloodshed would curse the kingdom. He said that the blood the father shed to secure the kingdom for his son would be the very thing that destroyed the son. And Alcuin was right. In the year 796, King Offa died. His son, Ecgfrith, stepped up to take control of the greatest empire Britain had seen since the Romans. But Ecgfrith ruled for only 141 days. He died suddenly. And because Offa had ruthlessly murdered every other legitimate heir in the royal family, the dynasty instantly collapsed. The great Mercian machine stalled. Within a generation, the supremacy was over. The smaller kingdoms rebelled. The power centre shifted south, away from Mercia, down into the kingdom of Wessex. The illusion of a permanent, unified English state shattered back into pieces. It proved a harsh truth about the Anglo-Saxon world. The institutions, the coinage, the trade, the boundaries were growing stronger, but the politics were still entirely dependent on the heartbeat of a single, terrifying man. When the man died, the system cracked, and it was about to crack wide open, because while the English kings were busy fighting each other over the scraps of the Mercian Empire, they had completely failed to notice what was happening out on the grey, freezing waters of the North Sea. The wealth of England, the silver pennies, the golden chalices in the monasteries, the bustling markets was no longer a secret. The scent of that wealth had drifted across the water. The wind was changing, and in the dark fjords of Scandinavia, the wolves were hungry once again. Chapter 5. The Fury of the Northmen. Close your eyes again and listen to the sound of the ocean. It is the 8th of June in the year 793. You are standing on the bleak, beautiful shores of Lindisfarne, the holy island off the northeastern coast of Northumbria. For 150 years, this place has been a sanctuary of absolute peace. Ever since the Irish monk Aidan walked across the tidal flats, Lindisfarne has been the spiritual beating heart of the English people. Inside the stone church, the air is thick with the sweet smell of burning frankincense. Monks in simple wool robes are kneeling on the cold floor, chanting softly in Latin. On the altar, illuminated by the flickering light of beeswax candles, rest the treasures of the church. Heavy golden crosses, silver chalices studded with red garnets and green emeralds, books bound in leather and encrusted with precious stones. To the monks, this wealth belongs to God. It is a symbol of heavenly glory. But out on the grey, freezing waters of the North Sea, a different kind of people are watching. And to them, this wealth is simply a prize waiting to be taken. Through the thick morning fog, a terrifying silhouette begins to emerge. It is a ship, but not a merchant vessel. It is incredibly long, narrow, and sits very low in the water. It is built of overlapping oak planks, flexed and sealed with tar to ride the violent ocean swells like a living serpent. At the front, carved out of dark wood, is the snarling head of a dragon, and then another ship emerges from the fog, and another. These are the longships of the Northmen, the Vikings. For centuries, England had felt safe behind its moat of seawater. The Anglo-Saxon kings fought each other on land, but they had completely neglected the sea. They had no navy. They had no coastal watchtowers. They believed the ocean was a barrier that protected them from the chaos of the continent. The Vikings proved them wrong in the most horrific way imaginable. Because of their shallow draft, the Viking longships didn't need a deep water port. They could sail straight up onto the sandy beach of Lindisfarne. Before the monks even knew what was happening, tall, heavily muscled men leaped over the sides of the ships. They carried round wooden shields painted in bright colours. They wielded heavy iron broadswords and terrifying, long-handled battle axes that could cleave a man in half. They did not speak Latin. They did not care about the Pope. They did not fear the Christian God. To a Viking warrior, a monastery wasn't a sacred sanctuary. It was a bank without any guards. It was a concentration of immense, undefended wealth, manned by men whose religion literally commanded them to turn the other cheek. It was an invitation to plunder. The attack was swift, and it was utterly merciless. The pagan warriors smashed down the heavy wooden doors of the church. The chanting stopped, replaced by the screams of the dying. The monks who tried to protect the altar were slaughtered where they stood, their blood spilling over the holy relics. Others were dragged out onto the beach in chains, destined to be sold as slaves in the markets of Scandinavia or the Middle East. Some were simply driven into the freezing sea and forced to drown. The Vikings stripped the church bare. They tore the jewelled covers off the sacred Gospels. They loaded the golden crosses and the silver cups into the hulls of their longships. And then, as quickly as they had arrived, they pushed the boats back out into the surf and vanished into the mist. When the news of the massacre at Lindisfarne reached the rest of the Christian world, it caused a psychological earthquake. Alcuin, the great English scholar working in the court of Charlemagne, wrote a letter that perfectly captures the sheer existential terror of that moment. Never before has such a terror appeared in Britain as we have now suffered from a pagan race, Alcuin wrote. Nor was it thought possible that such an inroad from the sea could be made. Behold the church of St. Cuthbert, splattered with the blood of the priests of God, stripped of all its ornaments. A place more venerable than all in Britain is given as a prey to pagan peoples. The people of England looked for a reason. They thought they were being punished by God. They looked at the sky and saw omens. The chronicles recorded fiery dragons flying in the air and massive thunderstorms. The following year, the Vikings struck the monastery at Jarrow. The year after that, they hit the sacred island of Iona in Scotland. The nightmare had begun. For the next several decades, the Viking threat was a terrifying, unpredictable weather pattern. They were hit-and-run raiders. They would appear on the horizon, sack a coastal town or a monastery, steal the wealth, and return to their icy fjords before the local Anglo-Saxon king could even mobilise his army. They were ghosts. You couldn't fight them, because you never knew where they would strike next. But as the 9th century progressed, the nature of the beast began to change. Back in Scandinavia, the population was booming. The The harsh, rocky soil of Norway and Denmark could no longer support the growing numbers of ambitious young men. At the same time, central authority in Denmark had temporarily collapsed, leaving powerful warlords free to gather massive independent fleets. These men had spent a generation raiding the shores of England and France. They knew the land, they knew the rivers. They knew the political weaknesses of the Anglo-Saxon kings, who were still too busy fighting each other to present a united front. The Vikings looked at the rich, green fields of England, and they made a collective decision. They were no longer coming just to steal the silver and go home. They were coming to take the land. In the autumn of the year 865, a fleet of unprecedented size appeared off the coast of East Anglia. This was not a raiding party. This was an invasion force. The English chroniclers, trembling as they wrote the words, called it the Great Heathen Army. It was led by terrifying legendary figures, men with names like Halfdan, and a leader of terrifying intellect and cruelty, known to history as Ivar the Boneless. When this massive army landed, they didn't immediately attack. They were calculating. They demanded horses from the terrified people of East Anglia in exchange for a temporary peace. They spent the winter resting, mounting their troops, and studying the political map of the island. They realised that the great northern kingdom of Northumbria was deeply vulnerable. The Northumbrians were in the middle of a bitter civil war, split between two rival kings fighting for the throne. In the year 866, the Great Heathen Army rode north. They swept into Northumbria and captured the ancient, walled city of York. It was a strategic masterpiece. The two rival English kings suddenly realised the immense danger and agreed to a temporary truce. They joined their forces and launched a desperate counterattack to take back their capital. It was a slaughter. The Viking army crushed the Northumbrian forces beneath the walls of York. Both of the English kings were killed. According to Dark Norse legends, one of the kings was subjected to a horrific ritual execution known as the Blood Eagle, a testament to the absolute brutality of the new masters of the North. Northumbria, the kingdom of King Edwin, the kingdom of the great scholar Bede, the kingdom that had produced the finest illuminated manuscripts in Europe, simply ceased to exist as an independent power. The Vikings installed a puppet king to handle the administrative burdens and took the wealth for themselves. One kingdom down, 3 to go. The Great Heathen Army then turned its terrifying gaze southward, toward Mercia. The Mercians, remembering the fate of York, did not want to fight. They paid the Vikings a massive amount of treasure to simply go away. So the army turned east, back to East Anglia, the place where they had first landed. It was the year 869. The king of East Anglia was a young man named Edmund. Unlike the Northumbrians, Edmund decided he would not run, and he would not pay. He gathered his forces and met the Danish army in open battle. The English were completely overwhelmed. King Edmund was captured alive. The Viking warlords brought him before Ivar the Boneless. They offered him a choice. He could keep his life, and even his crown, if he would renounce his Christian faith and swear absolute loyalty to the pagan warlords. Edmund refused. The death of King Edmund became one of the most powerful stories of the early Middle Ages. The Vikings tied the young king to an oak tree. They beat him with iron rods. Then, using him as target practice, they shot him full of arrows until, as the chroniclers wrote, he looked like a bristling hedgehog. Finally, they struck off his head and threw it into the thick brambles of the forest. Edmund died a martyr. He became Saint Edmund, a symbol of English resistance that would inspire the nation for centuries. But his bravery could not save his kingdom. East Anglia was completely conquered. Its royal line was extinguished. The Vikings divided the farmland among themselves and settled down. 2 kingdoms down. 2 to go. In the year 873, the army moved against Mercia once again. This time, they didn't want money. They wanted the land. They marched into the heartland of the Midlands. The king of Mercia, a man named Burgred, looked at the size of the Viking host. He looked at the smoking ruins of East Anglia and Northumbria. He realised that the era of the Mercian supremacy was truly, finally dead. King Burgred packed whatever treasure he could carry, abandoned his people, and fled the country. He travelled all the way to Rome, where he died as a broken exile. The Vikings divided Mercia in half. The eastern half they kept for themselves, carving out new estates and handing them over to their warriors. The western half they gave to a foolish English nobleman who acted as their puppet. 3 kingdoms down, in less than a decade, the Great Heathen Army had completely destroyed the political structure of the Anglo-Saxon world. The map of Britain, which had taken 400 years of blood and statecraft to draw, was ripped to shreds. The eastern half of the island was now under absolute Viking control. It would become known as the Danelaw, the place where Danish law, Danish customs, and the Danish language ruled. If you look at a map of northern and eastern England today, you can still see the scars of this conquest. Hundreds of towns and villages end in by or thorp, words that come straight from the Old Norse language. Grimsby, Derby, Scunthorpe. Note, these weren't just raided, they were colonised. A profound, suffocating darkness fell over the island. The great monasteries were burned husks. The libraries were reduced to ash. The golden crosses were melted down and turned into arm rings for pagan warlords. Out of all the proud, independent Anglo-Saxon kingdoms that had emerged from the ruins of Roman Britain, only one remained. Down in the southwest, protected by dense forests and rolling chalk hills, lay the Kingdom of Wessex. It was the last fragile sanctuary of the English people, the last flickering candle in a room that was rapidly filling with a terrifying darkness. In the winter of the year 870, the Great Heathen Army packed up its camp, loaded its weapons, and marched south. They crossed the River Thames. They set up a heavily fortified camp at Reading, right on the border of Wessex. The wolves were at the door. The survival of the entire English civilization now rested on the shoulders of the West Saxons. And specifically, it rested on the shoulders of a quiet, scholarly young prince who suffered from chronic illness, a man who loved reading Latin poetry far more than he loved swinging a sword. His name was Alfred, and he was about to face the apocalypse. Chapter 6. Alfred's Stand. Listen to the wind rustling through the tall, dead reeds. It is the bitter, freezing winter of the year, 878. You are standing in the middle of a vast flooded marshland in Somerset, known as the Isle of Athelney. The air is thick with cold mist. The mud sucks at your boots. Somewhere in this miserable, freezing swamp hides the last Anglo-Saxon king. Just a few weeks earlier, the Kingdom of Wessex had been caught completely off guard. The Viking warlord Guthrum had launched a devastating surprise attack on the royal estate at Chippenham right in the middle of winter, a time when armies traditionally did not fight. The West Saxon defences shattered. The Viking horde poured across the borders, burning, looting and seizing the land. The people of Wessex submitted. They surrendered, except for King Alfred. Alfred fled into the impenetrable marshes of Athelney with a tiny, freezing band of loyal followers. He was reduced from a proud monarch to a hunted fugitive in his own land. He had no army, he had no gold. He was hiding in the mud, living off whatever fish and wild animals his men could catch. If you had looked at Alfred in that moment, shivering by a small, hidden campfire, you would have thought it was over. The Vikings had won. The light of English civilization was about to be snuffed out forever. But Alfred possessed something far more dangerous than a heavy sword. He possessed a terrifyingly resilient mind. He didn't panic. He didn't flee across the sea to France like other kings had done. He sat in the freezing mud, and he waited. He understood his enemy. He knew that the Viking army was vast, but it was spread out, gorging itself on the wealth of Wessex. He just needed to remind his people that their king was still alive. Quietly, invisibly, messengers slipped out of the swamps. They travelled through the dark forests and over the chalk hills, whispering to the local lords and the peasant militias. They passed on a single desperate message. When the spring comes, be ready. In the month of May, in the year 878, Alfred rode out of the marshes. He rode to a place called Egbert Stone, on the edge of the great Selwood forest, and there, a miracle happened. The people of Somerset, the people of Wiltshire, and the people of Hampshire emerged from the woods. The old chronicles tell us that when these men saw their king alive, they were filled with overwhelming joy. They had not been abandoned. Alfred organised this ragged, desperate army. He didn't have much time. He marched them immediately toward the Viking stronghold. At a place called Eddington, the two armies collided. Imagine the terrifying noise of an Anglo-Saxon shield wall. Hundreds of men, standing shoulder to shoulder, locking their heavy wooden shields together to form an impenetrable wall of painted wood and iron. The Vikings formed their own wall. And then, the two masses of humanity slammed into each other. It was an agonizing, suffocating push. Men screaming, axes splintering wood, swords scraping against chainmail. But the men of Wessex were fighting for their absolute survival. They pushed, and finally, the Viking shield wall broke. Guthrum and his terrified warriors fled to their fortress. Alfred besieged them. For 14 days, the Vikings starved behind their walls, until finally, Guthrum surrendered. It was a total crushing victory for Alfred. But what Alfred did next is what makes him a genius. He didn't execute Guthrum. He knew that killing one warlord would only invite 10 more to take his place across the sea. He needed a permanent solution. He needed to turn his enemy into a neighbour. Alfred demanded that Guthrum and his leading commanders accept Christian baptism. It was a masterstroke of diplomacy. Guthrum agreed. Alfred stood as his godfather. They signed a treaty that formally divided the island of Britain. Guthrum retreated his forces to the east and the north, beyond a defined border. He became a Christian king of East Anglia. The immediate threat was gone, but Alfred knew the peace would not last. He looked at his shattered kingdom. He realised that the old Anglo-Saxon way of doing things, relying on a king to ride around with his army to fight off raids, was completely obsolete. The Vikings were too fast. To save England, Alfred had to redesign it. He became the first true urban planner in English history. Over the next decade, Alfred ordered the construction of a network of 30 heavily fortified towns across Wessex. They were called Burhs. He didn't just build military forts, he built living, breathing communities. Take the ancient Roman city of Winchester. Alfred ordered his surveyors to go into the ruins and lay down an entirely new grid of streets, a grid you can still walk on today. He measured the streets using a standard length of 66 feet. He created a brilliant, highly structured system. The local landowners were given a strict obligation. They had to provide the men to build and guard the walls of the burh. In exchange, they were given safe plots of land inside the walls to store their grain and sell their goods. Suddenly, peasants and merchants weren't sitting ducks out in the open countryside. If a Viking ship appeared on the horizon, the warning would go out, and everyone would retreat behind the high wooden walls of the nearest burh. The Viking hit-and-run strategy was completely neutralised. They couldn't break through the walls quickly, and if they sat down for a long siege, Alfred's new mobile army would arrive to crush them. And Alfred didn't stop at the shoreline. He understood that to defeat a seafaring enemy, you had to meet them on the water. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle tells us that Alfred ordered the construction of a new fleet. He didn't just copy the Viking ships, he designed them himself. He commanded his shipwrights to build vessels that were twice as long as the Viking longships. Some of them had 60 oars or more. They were higher, heavier, and more stable in the water. Alfred was building an absolute fortress of a kingdom. But as he grew older, he looked around and realised a terrifying truth. He had saved the physical bodies of his people. He had saved their land. But the soul of his nation was bleeding to death. Decades of Viking raids had annihilated the great monasteries. The magnificent libraries of the north were ash. The priests who survived were uneducated and traumatised. Alfred complained bitterly that hardly anyone south of the River Thames could even understand a simple letter written in Latin. The language of faith, of law, of history, was evaporating. A lesser king would have said, "I have won the wars, my job is done." Alfred decided to become a teacher. He is the only English king before Henry VIII to actually write and translate books himself. He gathered a circle of brilliant scholars around him, importing intellectuals from Europe to his court. At the age of 40, Alfred taught himself Latin. Then, he began the painstaking work of translating the most important books of the civilized world out of Latin and into the everyday language of the people Old English. He translated philosophy. He translated the history written by the monk Bede. He wanted his bishops, his lords, and his judges to read these books. He wanted them to remember what it meant to be civilized. He wanted them to understand justice and history and faith. He commanded that all the young, free-born men of wealth in his kingdom be taught to read English. It was an astonishing cultural revival. Alfred wasn't just repairing the damage of the Vikings. He was laying the intellectual foundation for a modern state. He was forging a deep shared identity among his people. When Alfred the Great died in the year 899, he left behind a miracle. He had inherited a kingdom on the absolute brink of annihilation. He left behind a fortified, wealthy, highly organised state with a literate administration and a powerful navy. He never ruled the whole island. The Danelaw still covered the north and the east, but Alfred had saved the idea of England. He had kept the flame burning in the dark. Now, it would be up to his children and his grandchildren to take that flame, march out of Wessex, and take the rest of the country back. Chapter 7. The Unready King and the Danish Empire. Take a deep breath and let the centuries slip by. After Alfred the Great died in the freezing winter of the late 9th century, his children and grandchildren did not let his fire go out. They took the brilliant fortified machine of Wessex that he had built, and they marched north. For the next 50 years, kings with names like Edward the Elder and Athelstan pushed the Vikings back. They reclaimed the lost territories. They absorbed the old kingdom of Mercia. They built more forts. They forced the kings of Scotland and Wales to bow before them. By the middle of the 10th century, under the reign of a king named Edgar the Peaceful, the island experienced a golden age. It was a time of deep, quiet stability. The monasteries were rebuilt. The laws were unified. For the first time, a single king ruled a relatively united England. When Edgar was crowned in a spectacular ceremony in the year 973, he was anointed with holy oil. He was not just a warlord anymore. He was the undisputed, sacred monarch of the English people. But as we have learned on this journey, in the Dark Ages, Golden Ages are just illusions. They are built on the fragile heartbeat of a strong man. When King Edgar died, the peace died with him. He left behind 2 young sons, and the English nobility immediately split into vicious, warring factions. The older son, Edward, was crowned king. But just 4 years later, while visiting a royal estate at Corfe, he was surrounded by the supporters of his younger brother and brutally murdered. And so, stepping over the bleeding corpse of his half-brother, a new boy king was placed on the throne. His name was Ethelred. Ethelred ruled for nearly 40 years, and history has not been kind to him. We know him today by a famous nickname, Ethelred the Unready. But that translation is actually a misunderstanding of a dark Anglo-Saxon pun. His name, Ethelred, literally meant noble counsel. His nickname, Unready, meant no counsel or ill-advised. He was the noble counsel who had no counsel. He was the king who never knew what to do. And unfortunately for Ethelred, he was about to face the ultimate test, because across the sea, in Denmark, the Vikings had changed. They were no longer the disorganized bands of hungry raiders who had attacked Lindisfarne 2 centuries earlier. They were a unified, terrifying military state. Under the command of King Harold Bluetooth, and later his son Sweyn Forkbeard, the Danes had built massive, perfectly circular military fortresses. If you dig into the earth of Denmark today, you can find the remains of these camps, like the one at Trelleborg. They were masterpieces of geometry and discipline. Inside these massive earthen walls were perfectly aligned rows of huge timber halls, designed to house thousands of highly trained professional soldiers. These were not wild pirates. This was a standing army, and they were looking at England. The attacks began quietly at first, small raids on the coast, testing the waters. But the English defences, so carefully designed by Alfred, had grown lazy during the long years of peace. The walls of the fortified towns were crumbling. The militias were out of practice. In the year 991, a massive Danish fleet sailed up the Blackwater estuary in Essex. The local English commander, a proud elderly nobleman named Bertnoth, gathered the local militia and marched down to the river to stop them. The 2 armies faced each other across a narrow causeway that was flooded by the high tide. When the tide went out, the Viking leader shouted across the mudflats. He demanded that the English pay them gold to go away. Bertnoth refused. He told the Vikings they would pay their tribute with the points of their spears and the edges of their swords. It was a brave, beautiful speech, but it ended in tragedy. The Battle of Maldon was a crushing defeat for the English. Bertnoth was killed, and his army was slaughtered in the mud. When the news of this disaster reached King Ethelred, he panicked. He didn't rally his forces, he didn't build new ships. Instead, he did exactly what the Vikings had demanded in the first place. He reached into the royal treasury, and he paid them to leave. He paid them £10,000 of solid silver. In the Anglo-Saxon world, this was a staggering, incomprehensible fortune. It was called the Danegeld, the Danish tax. To raise this kind of money, the king's government had to unleash a ruthless, hyper-efficient tax machine. The royal agents rode out into every county, every hundred, every tiny farming village. They evaluated every acre of land. They knocked on the doors of the poorest peasants, demanding their silver, their cattle, their grain. The English people bled to pay the ransom, but if you pay the wolf to go away, the wolf only learns that you are made of meat. A few years later, the Vikings returned, and this time they demanded £16,000 of silver. Ethelred paid it. A few years after that, they returned again, demanding £24,000 of silver. Ethelred paid it. The wealth of an entire civilization was being systematically drained and loaded onto foreign ships. In Scandinavia today, archaeologists pull thousands upon thousands of English silver pennies out of the ground. They find runestones carved by Swedish mercenaries, proudly boasting that they went to England and took the Danegeld. The psychological toll on the English people was devastating. They were working themselves into the grave, only to hand the fruits of their labour to their worst enemies. By the year 1002, the pressure inside the kingdom was reaching a boiling point. The king was terrified. He was surrounded by rumours of treason. He believed that the Danish mercenaries he had hired to protect him were actually plotting to murder him in his sleep. So, King Ethelred made a decision born of absolute hysterical paranoia. He sent out secret orders across the kingdom. On St. Brice's Day, the 13th of November, in the year 1002, the English were commanded to rise up and exterminate every single Danish person living within their borders. It was an order for a massacre, and in many places, the people obeyed. The anger and the humiliation of the Danegeld had driven them to madness. In the city of Oxford, a group of Danish families, men, women and children, fled from the violent mobs and barricaded themselves inside the great stone church of St. Fried's-Wide. They thought the holy ground would protect them. The English citizens of Oxford didn't care. They piled wood against the heavy wooden doors, struck a flint, and burned the church to the ground, with everyone trapped inside. When the ashes cooled, the king officially pardoned the people of Oxford, claiming the Danes had deserved it. But this wasn't justice. It was a fatal mistake, because among the people murdered in the St. Brice's Day massacre was a young woman who happened to be the sister of Swine Forkbeard, the terrifying king of Denmark. The hit-and-run raids were over. This was now a war of absolute annihilation. The very next year, King Swine arrived on the shores of England with a fleet of longships that darkened the horizon. He didn't want silver anymore. He wanted blood. He wanted the crown. For the next 10 years, England was a burning nightmare. Swine's professional army marched wherever they pleased. They burned the city of Norwich. They swept through Wessex, leaving a trail of ashen corpses. The English armies, led by treacherous, cowardly nobles who constantly betrayed each other, simply melted away. Ethelred tried desperately to build a new fleet, but the ships were destroyed by a storm and by internal mutiny. The defence of the realm had completely collapsed. In the year 1011, the Vikings laid siege to the holy city of Canterbury. They captured the archbishop, a man named Aelfir. They dragged him to their camp in Greenwich and demanded a massive ransom. The archbishop refused to let his impoverished people pay for his life. During a drunken feast, the Viking warriors lost their temper. They pelted the old archbishop with heavy beef bones and the skulls of cattle until he fell to the ground, and then they split his head open with an axe. The horror of that moment even disgusted some of the Viking commanders. A famous warlord named Thorkel the Tall was so sickened by the murder that he actually defected, taking 45 of his ships to fight for the English king. But it was too little, too late. By the year 1013, the country was broken. The people of the Danelaw in the north openly welcomed King Sweyn. Even the proud city of London finally opened its gates to the invader. King Ethelred, the Unready, the man who had lost the greatest kingdom in Europe, boarded a ship and fled across the English Channel. He went into exile in the court of his wife's family, in a rising, powerful territory on the coast of France, a territory called Normandy. Remember that detail. It is the fuse that will eventually ignite the end of the world. For the first time, a Viking king sat on the throne of England. But King Swine ruled for only a few weeks before he suddenly died. In the chaotic aftermath, Ethelred returned from Normandy for one last, desperate attempt to reclaim his kingdom. But he was old, sick, and his time was up. When he finally died in the year 1016, the defence of England fell to his son, Edmund. They called him Edmund Ironside. And for a few brilliant, bloody months, He fought like a true grandson of Alfred the Great, but he was up against a new Danish monster, Sweyn's young son, a ruthless, brilliant tactician named Cnut. In the autumn of 1016, the English and the Danish armies met for the final showdown on a hill in Essex, a place called Ashington. It was a slaughter. The English forces were betrayed in the middle of the battle by one of their own commanders, a man who pulled his troops back just as the lines clashed. The cream of the English nobility was hacked to pieces on that hill. Edmund Ironside survived the battle, but he died mysteriously just a few weeks later. And so, Cnut the Great became the undisputed king of all England. He was a fascinating, terrifying man. He started his reign like a classic bloody conqueror. To secure his throne, he hunted down and executed the surviving members of the English royal family. He murdered anyone who could possibly challenge him. He then married Ethelred's widow, Queen Emma, effectively taking his dead rival's wife to legitimize his own rule. But once his grip on power was absolute, Cnut transformed. He didn't want to rule as a foreign tyrant. He wanted to be an English king. He sent his massive, expensive Viking fleet back to Denmark, keeping only a small, elite bodyguard. He agreed to govern according to the old laws of King Edgar. He became incredibly pious. He showered the English monasteries with gold and silver. He walked barefoot through the streets of Rome to meet the Pope. Within a few years, Cnut inherited the crowns of Denmark and Norway. He created a massive, unprecedented North Sea empire, linking Scandinavia and Britain into a single, vast economic and political zone. Under King Cnut, England experienced 20 years of surprising peace and prosperity. The long nightmare of the raids was finally over. But Cnut made a structural change to the kingdom that would have fatal consequences. Because he was ruling a massive international empire, he couldn't be in England all the time. He needed powerful men to run the country while he was away. So, he divided England into 4 massive earldoms: Northumbria, East Anglia, Mercia, and Wessex. He gave these vast territories to a handful of men. He elevated local nobles to heights of power that no subject had ever held before. The most famous of these men was a shadowy, incredibly ambitious noble named Godwin, who was made the Earl of Wessex. Godwin and his family became so wealthy and so powerful that they began to rival the king himself. They controlled vast private armies. They owned unimaginable tracts of land. Cnut was strong enough to keep these super earls in line, but when Cnut finally died in the year 1035, his empire shattered. His sons fought over the scraps, and within 7 years, the Danish royal line was completely extinct. The English nobles, exhausted by the foreign rulers, reached across the sea to Normandy. They called back the last surviving son of Ethelred the Unready, a quiet, deeply religious man who had spent his entire adult life in exile. His name was Edward. History would remember him as Edward the Confessor. When Edward arrived in England in the year 1042, to take the crown of his ancestors, he found a kingdom that looked peaceful on the surface, but underneath it was a powder keg. The great earldoms were effectively independent states. The Godwin family of Wessex was waiting in the shadows, hungry for absolute power, and across the water, the terrifying, heavily armoured knights of Normandy were watching carefully. The long Anglo-Saxon day was drawing to a close, the sky was turning red, and the final, bloody sunset was only a few years away. Chapter 8, The Sunset at Hastings. We have finally reached the end of our journey. The year is 1066, a year that hangs over English history like a dark, heavy storm cloud. But before the storm breaks, let us pause for a moment in the quiet, fading light of the reign of King Edward the Confessor. If you had walked through the royal court in the final years of Edward's life, you would not have seen a nation of barbarians. You would have seen one of the most sophisticated, tightly managed governments in all of Europe. Listen to the scratching of goose-feather quills on parchment. In the king's chancery, a small army of educated priests was constantly at work. They were writing out royal writs, short, highly efficient documents announcing the transfer of land, sealed with a heavy pendant of royal wax. They were maintaining massive, incredibly detailed archives. They knew exactly how many hides of land were in every county, who owned them, and how much tax they owed. These were the meticulous, ghostly records that the Normans would later use to compile their famous Domesday Book. But the system itself, the deep, administrative nervous system of the country, was purely Anglo-Saxon. The island was divided into shires, Each shire was managed by a local sheriff, a man who answered directly to the king. The courts functioned. The silver coins were pure and unified. The Anglo-Saxons had built a masterpiece of early medieval statecraft, but it all rested on a single, fatal flaw. King Edward had no children. The throne was empty. On the 5th of January, 1066, Edward the Confessor closed his eyes for the last time. The Royal Council, the Wighton, acted immediately. They knew the country was in mortal danger. They bypassed the distant, bloodline heirs and chose the strongest military commander in the land. They handed the crown to Harold Godwinson, the Earl of Wessex. Harold was a brilliant, battle-hardened soldier, but the moment the heavy gold crown was placed upon his head, a timer started ticking. In the cold, clear skies of that spring, a terrifying omen appeared. A massive comet with a long, burning tail blazed across the heavens. We know it today as Halley's Comet, but to the people of 11th century England, it was a star of doom. It meant the death of kings. Harold knew the invasion was coming. He just didn't know from which direction. Across the English Channel to the south, the Duke of Normandy, a ruthless, brilliant tactician named William, was cutting down entire forests to build a massive invasion fleet. William claimed that Edward had promised him the throne, and he had the backing of the Pope. Meanwhile, far to the north, across the freezing North Sea, another monster was waking up. Harald Hardrada, the King of Norway, a giant of a man who had fought his way from Russia to the Middle East, believed the English crown belonged to his Viking empire. King Harold Godwinson stood in the middle, looking at the sea. He gathered the largest army England had ever seen and stationed them on the southern coast, staring out across the water, waiting for the Normans. They waited through June, they waited through July, they waited through August, but the wind was blowing from the north. It kept the Norman ships pinned in their harbours in France. By September, the English farmers in Harold's army were out of food. Their crops were rotting in the fields. With a heavy heart, Harold was forced to disband his southern defence. He sent his men home to harvest the wheat, and at that exact moment, the northern wind brought the first nightmare to the shores of England. Harald Hardrada, the Norwegian giant, landed in the north with a fleet of 300 longships. He was joined by Harold's own treacherous brother, Tostig. They swept into Yorkshire and captured the city of York. When King Harold heard the news, he did not hesitate. He gathered his elite bodyguards, his housecarls, and he began one of the most astonishing forced marches in military history. He marched his men nearly 200 miles north in just 4 days. They moved so fast that the Viking invaders had absolutely no idea they were coming. On the 25th of September, 1066, the English army caught the Vikings completely by surprise at a place called Stamford Bridge. The Vikings were lounging in the warm autumn sun on the far side of the river. Many of them had left their heavy chainmail armour back at the ships. The English slammed into them with the fury of a desperate nation. The fighting on the narrow wooden bridge was horrific, a suffocating crush of axes and shields. By the time the sun went down, the Viking army was annihilated. Harald Hardrada, the terror of the north, took an arrow to the throat and died in the mud. Harold's brother, Tostig, was killed. Out of the 300 Viking ships that had arrived, only 24 were needed to carry the broken survivors back home. It was a magnificent total victory. The Anglo-Saxons had finally, permanently, broken the Viking threat, but there was no time to celebrate. 3 days later, the wind changed. The breeze shifted, blowing gently from the south, and Duke William of Normandy launched his fleet. On the 28th of September, the Norman ships landed on the empty, undefended beaches of Pevensey on the southern coast of England. King Harold was sitting at a feast in York, nursing his wounded men, when the messenger arrived. The news must have felt like a physical blow. Once again, Harold dragged his exhausted, bleeding army to their feet. They had just fought the battle of their lives, and now they had to march 200 miles back down south. They marched through the rain and the mud. They gathered whatever local militias they could find along the way. They were exhausted. Their muscles burned. Their boots were falling apart. But they marched, because the survival of their civilization depended on it. On the morning of the 14th of October, 1066, the two armies finally met. King Harold arranged his men on the top of a long, chalky ridge known as Senlac Hill, near the town of Hastings. Listen to the sound of the hill. 7,000 English soldiers stood shoulder to shoulder. They locked their heavy painted wooden shields together. They formed a solid, impenetrable wall of timber and iron. They beat their weapons against their shields, shouting their ancient war cries, "Out! Out! Out!" Below them, in the damp valley, stood the army of Normandy, archers, heavy infantry, and the most terrifying weapon of the age, heavily armoured knights mounted on massive war horses. The battle began at 9 in the morning. The Norman archers fired clouds of arrows up the hill, but they simply bounced off the English shields. The Norman infantry charged up the muddy slope, but they were hacked to pieces by the terrifying long-handled English battle axes. Again and again the Normans threw themselves at the shield wall. Again and again the English held the line. The discipline of the Anglo-Saxon soldiers was magnificent. As long as they stayed on the hill, as long as they kept the wall closed, they could not be beaten. As the afternoon dragged on, Duke William realised he was losing. He needed to break their discipline. He ordered his cavalry to charge the hill, and then, suddenly, to turn around and run away in apparent panic. It was a trick. A desperate, brilliant trick. The exhausted English militiamen, seeing their enemy fleeing, forgot their orders. They broke ranks. They cheered, abandoned the safety of the shield wall, and ran down the hill to chase the retreating Normans. The moment they reached the bottom of the valley, losing their high ground and their solid formation, the Norman knights turned their horses around. The slaughter was absolute. Without the shield wall, the English infantry were helpless against the charging war horses. They were cut down in the long grass. William repeated the trick, and again parts of the English line broke and were destroyed. As the sun began to set, turning the autumn sky a deep, bruised purple, the English line was dangerously thin. The final Norman assault pushed to the very top of the hill. In the centre of the carnage, King Harold fought desperately beside his royal standard. The legends say he was struck in the eye by a falling arrow. Other accounts say he was hacked down by 4 Norman knights. It doesn't really matter. What matters is that Harold fell, and when the king died, the heart of the army stopped beating. The surviving English soldiers fled into the darkening woods. The shield wall was gone. The Battle of Hastings was over. Duke William pitched his tent that night among the thousands of English dead. He would march to London, and on Christmas Day, in the great stone abbey built by Edward the Confessor, he would be crowned King of England. The Anglo-Saxon era had come to an end. The golden Mead Halls were soon torn down. The Normans built massive cold stone castles to dominate the landscape. They replaced the English bishops with French monks. They brought a new language, a new culture, a new ruthless aristocracy. The English lords who survived the battle were stripped of their lands and reduced to peasants in their own country. It feels like a tragedy, a complete erasure. Remember the story of the Sparrow in the winter storm? The Anglo-Saxon civilization was that sparrow. It had flown out of the dark, freezing night of the 5th century. It had spent 600 years inside the warm, illuminated Hall of History. It had built beautiful things, the gold of Sutton Hoo, the poetry of Beowulf, the brilliant silver coins of Offa, the fortified towns of Alfred the Great. And now, at Hastings, the door had opened, and the Sparrow flew back out into the violent storm, vanishing from sight. But civilizations don't really vanish. The Normans conquered the people, but they kept the machine. They kept the shires. They kept the sheriffs. They kept the incredibly efficient tax system and the royal writs. The deep, structural bones of England, the very shape of its towns, the borders of its counties, the fundamental concepts of its local laws remained profoundly, undeniably Anglo-Saxon. They had taken a ruined, abandoned Roman island and built a nation so rich and so well organised that it became the ultimate prize of the medieval world. They lost the crown, but they laid the foundation for the modern era. And as you lie there tonight, drifting towards sleep, think about those men on the hill at Hastings. Think about the monks shivering by candlelight, writing down the history of their people. Think about the peasants digging the great earthworks in the freezing rain. They are gone. Their timber halls have rotted away. But their echoes are still in the soil. Their words are still in our language. The fire in the hearth has died down to glowing embers. The wind outside is quiet now. It is time to let the dark ages rest. Thank you for walking through the centuries with me. I hope you found some warmth in the Mead Hall and some peace in the shadows. Close your eyes, let the history fade into dreams. Good night.